One evening, a mother set a plate of chicken and rice on the table in front of her 5-year-old daughter, and then she handed her some plastic silverware. The woman made a plate for herself too, and then she sat down to eat. But before she could take a bite, she looked over and noticed that her daughter was struggling to use her fork. She kept poking empty spots on her plate like she didn't really understand how to use the fork, which she definitely did. She asked her daughter, hey, do you need help with that? And the little girl's voice trembled as she said she just couldn't find her food. And then the mother watched in total shock and confusion as her daughter brought her fork down hard on the edge of her plate, not even touching her food, tipping it over and sending all her dinner flying across the table. The little girl burst out crying, and the mother just stared at the mess, trying to understand what was wrong with her normally cheerful, happy daughter. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please take the follow button to an amusement park and convince them to go on the biggest roller coaster, and then once you're on the ride, when the follow button's not looking, quietly disengage their safety harness. This episode is called A Dark Discovery. One weekday morning in 2005, Gabriela Ortiz Herrera stood in her small kitchen in Boston, Massachusetts, stirring a pan of scrambled eggs. She stepped away from the stove to grab a stack of plates from her cabinet, and then she set them on the table just as her oven started to beep. She turned off the oven and pulled out a tray of biscuits. After setting the biscuits down to cool, she paused to take a deep breath and sip her coffee. For Gabriela, the last few days had been really hectic. Some of her relatives were visiting from the Bronx and New York City, and while Gabriela's 5-year-old daughter, Camilla, loved having her 4 cousins and her grandmother around, hosting the extended family was a big job, especially in their very modest apartment. Gabriela stirred the eggs until they finished cooking. Then she turned off the stove, set all the food on the table, and called to her family that breakfast was served. Gabriela's nieces and nephews came barreling down the stairs, followed closely by their grandmother, Maria, who was so young and energetic that she could keep up with the kids. And then a long moment later, Gabriela's 5-year-old daughter, Camilla, came down after them. Gabriela watched her daughter walk down the stairs very slowly and gingerly, keeping one of her small hands on the railing as if she were trying to steady herself. The little girl made it to the bottom of the stairs and slowly walked into the living room, but then she accidentally bumped into the coffee table and started looking around as if she didn't even understand that she had walked into the table. Gabriela asked her daughter if she was okay, and Camilla looked up at her mom with tears in her eyes, and she told her mom that actually her head hurt so much that she wasn't hungry. And then suddenly Camilla was sobbing, saying that she wished her head didn't hurt all the time. While her relatives filled their plates, Gabriela squatted down next to her daughter and wiped the tears away from her cheeks. For the last few months, Camilla had been complaining that she had a headache almost every single day. At first, the pain did not seem that bad, so Gabriela figured her daughter was just tired or maybe dehydrated from playing so hard, and so Gabriela had just given her daughter water and over-the-counter medicine, and Camilla did seem to get better. But in the last few days, Camilla's headaches had gotten so bad that they were making her cry like this, and now she wouldn't even eat because of her headache. Gabriela turned around to her extended family and explained what was going on with her daughter. She said she had to take Camilla to the hospital to get her headaches checked out. Camilla's grandmother insisted on going with them, and that meant that all the cousins would be coming too. So all the family pushed their food aside, and they all packed into Gabriela's car and headed towards Boston Children's Hospital. About half an hour later, Gabriela helped her little daughter onto a bed inside of the pediatric emergency room. The walls of the room they were in were painted with all these colorful images from popular children's books, but the cheerful decor did not seem to make Camilla feel any less miserable. The only thing that helped her was the fact that her dad, Joel, had shown up at the hospital too. Gabriela had called him at work, and he had left early to come be with the family. Little Camilla sat with her father, Joel, on the hospital bed and leaned her head on his shoulder, while a nurse brought in extra chairs for the large family. Gabriella had already told the nurse about Camilla's headache symptoms, and now they were waiting for an ER doctor to come examine her. A few minutes later, a tall, thin man in a white coat entered the room and shook hands with Camilla's entire family. He introduced himself as Dr. Arthur Patton and then turned to Gabriella and asked her to tell him about her daughter. Gabriella said that normally Camilla was the super high-energy kid. She wasn't in school yet, but she was very bright, and Gabriella and Joel read her books almost every night before bed. Camilla was also very close with her entire extended family. She actually stayed with her grandmother Maria in the Bronx in New York every other month, and then stayed with her parents the rest of the time. Maria was still in her 40s, and she was virtually co-parenting Camilla as well as her cousins in New York, which was a tall order. All the kids were young and totally rambunctious, except for little Camilla, ever since she developed these headaches. Gabriella explained that Camilla's pain seemed minor at first, but it had gotten worse over time. Camilla said it felt like somebody was squeezing her head really hard, and that where it hurt most was behind her forehead and eyes. Gabriella said that it appeared like the pain seemed to fade whenever Camilla was busy, but it never really went away. Dr. Patton nodded and asked Gabriella if her daughter had any other symptoms that concerned her. Gabriella said that actually yes, recently, in addition to these headaches, her daughter had seemed clumsier than normal. She would bump into things as if she wasn't seeing them, and once when she was eating, it was like she couldn't figure out how to use her fork during dinner, which totally didn't make sense. But Gabriella admitted that, perhaps her daughter was kind of teasing her with the silverware thing, but she really couldn't be sure. Dr. Patton made a note of this. Then he asked if little Camilla took any regular medications, and her mother said no. Sometimes she gave her daughter over-the-counter pain medicine, but that was it. Dr. Patton nodded. He said headaches were common and usually went away on their own. But the fact that Camilla's pain had lasted so long and become so severe was concerning. Plus, her clumsiness could be a sign of a neurological problem. Gabriella's stomach twisted with anxiety, and she started worrying that she had waited too long to bring Camilla to a doctor. She knew she must have looked terrified because Dr. Patton quickly assured her that little Camilla was almost certainly fine. They just needed to perform a quick physical examination to make sure. Camilla's father, Joel, helped Camilla sit upright while the doctor checked her vital signs. He tested her pulse, blood pressure, and temperature, and felt along her scalp and temples for sore spots. After that, he shined a small light into her eyes to make sure her pupils dilated correctly, and then Dr. Patton stepped back and told the parents that their daughter seemed normal. But Camilla was obviously in a lot of pain, and so the doctor said he didn't want to send her home quite yet without making absolutely sure she was okay. So the doctor offered to call in the hospital's neurology fellow, who had just finished his medical training, for a second opinion. Gabriella eagerly nodded. She still felt nervous, but she was thankful that Dr. Patton was doing everything he could to help their daughter. About 30 minutes later, a well-known pediatric neurologist named Dr. David Urian entered Camilla's hospital room. Dr. Urian was an old, kindly man with gray hair, glasses, and a bow tie, and he had been at his office at nearby Harvard Medical School when the neurology fellow had called him and said they had this puzzling case at Children's Hospital. There was a 5-year-old girl suffering from chronic headaches, clumsiness, and confusion, but her physical and neurological exams both looked normal. The fellow had asked Dr. Urian to come over and see if he could figure out what was going on with her. And so now, Dr. Urian saw Camilla's mother, father, and extended family standing around Camilla's bed, watching her anxiously. Dr. Urian introduced himself and said hello, and Camilla's relatives nodded and waved, but the little girl herself didn't even acknowledge him. She just stared down at her feet, looking scared and uncomfortable. The neurology fellow, who was very clean-cut and looked to be about 30 years old, handed Dr. Urian a copy of Camilla's medical charts and briefed the older doctor on what they knew so far. Dr. Urian said he wanted to start by doing another neurological exam. The fellow stayed in the room to observe while Dr. Urian went to Camilla's bedside. Now that he was standing over her, Camilla looked up at him and blinked several times. The doctor asked her for her name and birthday, and she answered both questions correctly. Next, Dr. Urian asked Camilla to push with her arms and legs against his hands, and when she did, she seemed strong. Then he asked her to walk around the room, and she didn't have any problems balancing. When she sat back down, he told her to close her eyes. Then, he touched a tuning fork to her arms and legs and asked her to tell him where she felt the cold metal. Again, Camilla answered correctly. Finally, Dr. Urian shined a small flashlight into the girl's eyes, and her pupils dilated normally, just like Dr. Patton had seen earlier. However, the neurologist wasn't actually looking at Camilla's pupils. He was looking behind them, into the very back of her eye, at an area called the retina. Dr. Urian carefully examined the tiny blood vessels in Camilla's retinas. Normally, the blood vessels deep inside of a person's eyes pulsate at the same rate as their heartbeat, but Camilla's were not pulsating at all. Dr. Urian had only seen this a few times before, but he knew retinal veins stop pulsating when a patient has an unusually high amount of pressure inside of their skull, often from some kind of an injury. To him, this was an obvious sign that Camilla was not suffering from typical headaches. More likely, she was in agony because she had suffered a serious head injury at some point and had brain swelling or bleeding, or possibly she could even have a brain tumor. Dr. Urian didn't want to alarm Camilla's family, so he quietly excused himself and asked the neurology fellow to join him in the hall. And once they were out there, Dr. Urian quietly explained what he had seen inside of the girl's eyes. Then Dr. Urian went back into the room and told Camilla's family that he wanted to get a better idea of what was happening in Camilla's head by performing what's called a CT scan, which is a type of X-ray that creates detailed pictures of a patient's internal organs. Camilla's mother, Gabriella, looked very nervous and overwhelmed, but she said okay, and so Dr. Urian called the radiology department to order the scan. Less than half an hour later, Camilla's CT scan was finished, and Dr. Urian strode down a hallway, test results in hand. He had reviewed the black and white images of Camilla's brain, and he didn't see any evidence of swelling, bleeding, or a tumor, which was a good sign. But he didn't know how to square these results with what he saw inside of the girl's eyes. Dr. Urian feared that Camilla had a neurological problem that didn't show up on the CT scan. He knew CT scans didn't capture literally everything, and it was possible Camilla had some kind of hidden tumor or abnormality that was causing these symptoms. But Dr. Urian also knew that brain tumors in 5-year-olds were incredibly rare, and so there was no reason to make Camilla's family panic until he had a more definitive diagnosis. So he planned to choose his words very carefully, then he turned a corner in the hallway and opened the door to Camilla's room to speak with her family. When Gabriella heard the door open, she was sitting on the bed with Camilla's head in her lap. She watched her daughter blink at the sound of the door opening. Then Gabriella looked up at Dr. Urian and forced herself to smile, hoping her daughter would not see how truly afraid she actually was. Dr. Urian told Camilla's family that her CT scan results appeared normal, and right away, Gabriella immediately felt relief wash over her. Her forced smile suddenly became genuine. But Joel was not smiling, and neither was Camilla's grandmother, Maria. Maria asked the doctor what this meant for her granddaughter. If Camilla's CT scan was normal, then why did she keep getting these headaches? Like, what was going on here? Dr. Urian admitted that he was still trying to figure that out. He said he wanted to do another type of scan called an MRI with contrast. This was a much more advanced imaging technique than the CT scan, and it required doctors to inject Camilla with a special dye to make the image of her brain sharper and easier to read. The procedure could also be tricky for kids. Camilla would have to lie very still inside of a long tube-shaped machine that made a lot of loud noises. When she heard this, Gabriella suddenly was scared again. She felt like there might be something the neurologist wasn't telling her. Otherwise, why would he keep making her daughter undergo more tests? But Gabriella did not argue. She just said okay, and she watched the doctor leave the room. Then Gabriella looked down at her daughter's head in her lap, looking so small and so vulnerable. She gently brushed Camilla's long dark hair behind her ear and wondered what doctors could be looking for inside of her head. About an hour later, Dr. Urian and a whole medical team huddled around a computer screen in the radiology department to examine the results of Camilla's MRI with contrast. One doctor used a mouse to adjust the brightness and contrast of the image, and as the picture became clearer, Dr. Urian noticed something odd. Camilla's optic nerves, which connected her eyes to her brain, looked strangely bright, almost like they were painted to glow in the dark. Dr. Urian had never seen anything like this before, and he asked his team if any of them knew what this meant, and all of them shook their heads no. This was totally weird to them too. Unsure what else to do, the neurologist called the hospital's eye doctor, who told Dr. Urian to send Camilla right over for an exam. Just a few minutes after Camilla's eye exam, Dr. Urian, who was still in the radiology department looking over Camilla's MRI results, got a call back from the hospital's eye doctor. And he said something truly shocking. Camilla was almost totally blind. She had practically no vision at all in her right eye, and her left eye wasn't much better. Dr. Urian was speechless. Camilla had never said a word to her mother, her father, or grandmother about not being able to see. But the eye doctor told him that was actually pretty normal. Children Camilla's age often don't voice concerns about their vision because the way they see the world is kind of what's normal to them. They don't really know how they're supposed to see things yet. Dr. Urian thanked the doctor and hung up. He looked back at Camilla's MRI results, which now made a little more sense. Her optic nerves had somehow gotten damaged, and that's why they look so strange on the MRI. Camilla was not gradually becoming clumsy and confused because of a brain tumor. The child literally couldn't see. But all of this didn't explain why Camilla had lost her vision or how they could preserve the eyesight she still had. Clearly, pressure had to be building up in Camilla's skull, Dr. Urian thought, but from what? If it wasn't due to bleeding, swelling, or a tumor, maybe it was from an infection. And so now, Dr. Urian wanted to do one more test, and he already knew Camilla and her whole family were not going to like it. Later that afternoon, Gabriella sat next to Joel and Camilla on the hospital bed. They'd been in the ER for hours. Camilla's cousins were all bored and tired, and Maria just flipped kind of mindlessly through TV channels, hoping to find something to keep the kids entertained. Meanwhile, Camilla's headaches were relentless. After her eye exam, she'd come back into the room and laid down with her eyes shut, and she'd barely moved since. Just then, Gabriella heard a knock at the door, and Dr. Urian came inside. He said he had some surprising news. The results from Camilla's eye exam showed that she was almost completely blind. Gabriella just stared at the doctor in shock. She thought back to the evening when Camilla couldn't figure out how to use her fork, and she realized her daughter wasn't playing games. She really could not see the food on her plate. All those times Camilla had seemed confused or bumped into things, it was because the whole world looked blurry to her. Gabriella couldn't believe she'd missed something that now seemed so obvious. She looked over at Joel, who seemed just as dumbfounded. But before Gabriella or Joel or Maria could ask any questions, Dr. Urian said he wanted to perform yet another test to figure out what was causing the girl's blindness. He said Camilla needed to undergo something called a spinal tap, which is a procedure where doctors insert a needle into the patient's spine and remove the sample of cerebrospinal fluid. Analyzing this fluid can help doctors diagnose brain infections. But at this point, Gabriella was starting to feel like her daughter was turning into a human pincushion. Camilla had already had a physical exam, 2 neurological exams, an eye exam, a CT scan, and an MRI with contrast. Now, Dr. Urian wanted to jab a needle into her daughter's spine? Gabriella wondered if this was too much for her daughter. But Dr. Urian promised the procedure might be scary sounding, but it was safe. Plus, it was necessary, because he still hadn't determined the cause of Camilla's terrible headaches, let alone her vision loss. Gabriella took a deep breath and said, "Okay, fine," as Joel wrapped an arm around her shoulders for support. A few minutes later, a different doctor came into the room to perform the spinal tap. He instructed Camilla to lie sideways on the bed and curl up into a ball. Gabriella held her daughter's hand tightly as the doctor cleaned Camilla's lower back and gave her a numbing shot. Then the doctor inserted a long, thin needle into Camilla's spine. The needle was attached to a syringe, and as the doctor pulled the stopper backwards, the syringe slowly filled with clear fluid. The doctor removed the needle, placed a bandage on Camilla's back, and said they would send her spinal fluid to the lab for analysis right away. Then the doctor left the room, and Gabriella loosened her grip on her daughter's hand. About 45 minutes later, Dr. Urian was in his office when he received the results of Camilla's spinal tap. There was no unusual bacteria in her spinal fluid, which ruled out the possibility of a brain infection. But the results also showed that the pressure inside of her head and spinal column was dangerously high, 2.5 times the normal level. This confirmed what Dr. Urian had already concluded, but he still didn't know where the pressure was coming from. All he knew was that there was no evidence of the usual causes of brain swelling. And yet the pressure inside of Camilla's head was so high that it had damaged her optic nerves and caused her to lose her vision. And as Dr. Urian thought this over, he suddenly remembered that there was actually a name for this condition. It was called a pseudotumor cerebri. This meant Camilla had many of the symptoms associated with a brain tumor, but didn't actually have a tumor. This condition was so rare, especially in children, that Dr. Urian had not even considered it until just now. Dr. Urian rushed back to Camilla's hospital room and told her family about her diagnosis. He said pseudotumors can be caused by a variety of things, and he needed their help to figure out what caused this one in Camilla. The neurologist asked the family again if she took any medications or if there was any way she could have taken somebody else's medication by accident. Camilla's mother, father, and grandmother all said no, there was no way. Dr. Urian didn't want to offend Camilla's guardians by continuing to press them, so he printed out a list of all the possible causes of Camilla's condition and gave it to her family. Her mother, father, and grandmother quickly began to look over this list, and before long, the doctor noticed Camilla's grandmother, Maria. Her expression completely changed. Her eyes widened as she stared at the sheet, and then she looked up at him in a total panic. Maria said she might know what made Camilla sick, but she would have to go all the way home to the Bronx to get it. While Maria traveled to and from New York, Joel took his nieces and nephews back to his and Gabriella's small apartment, and Gabriella stayed with their daughter at the hospital. Dr. Urian kept an eye on Camilla and worked to try to reduce the pressure inside of her head by draining more fluid from her spine and giving her special medications. And little by little, Camilla did start feeling better. The next day, Maria returned from the Bronx, and she sheepishly handed Dr. Urian a small bottle. She said her granddaughter's illness was definitely all her fault. Then the doctor read the label on the bottle she handed him, and all of Camilla's symptoms suddenly made sense. The bottle that Maria gave the doctor contained fish oil supplements, which are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, as well as vitamins A and D. Maria took these supplements religiously. She believed they strengthened her heart and also reduced her pain from arthritis. And when Camilla stayed with her grandmother in the Bronx every other month, Maria gave her 1 pill a day too. But when Dr. Urian looked at the bottle, he realized these fish oil pills were not formulated for kids. They were made for adults. So every time Camilla took one, she was getting 3 times the recommended dose of vitamin A for a child her age. That much vitamin A can wreak havoc on a young person's body and lead to irreversible organ damage. And in this case, it caused pressure to build up inside of Camilla's head, which then caused her to lose her vision and develop constant, debilitating headaches. Obviously, from this point forward, nobody in this family gave Camilla any more fish oil, which halted any further damage to Camilla's eyesight and nervous system. And while Camilla did luckily regain some of her vision, her eyesight was, unfortunately, permanently altered. She's now able to live a relatively normal life with the help of glasses and contact lenses, but she still does get the occasional headache. On the morning of June 26, 1826, 38-year-old Samuel Willie Jr. stepped out of his house in a remote area of New Hampshire's White Mountain Range called the Notch. His wife, Polly, was at his side, and together they looked around in shock because the land surrounding their home was almost completely destroyed. There had been a huge storm the previous night, and so Sam and Polly had been expecting some damage. But what they were seeing now was far worse than they had imagined. The heavy rain had caused the river in front of their home to completely overflow, so half of their property was now completely submerged in water. The deluge had also triggered a rock slide from one side of the mountain slopes behind them, so there were also rocks and mud and entire trees that were now kind of littering their yard and adjacent fields. Sam saw, luckily, the slide had missed their house and the barn where they kept their livestock, but only barely. And there was damage to those structures from the storm itself that he would have to repair. So Sam began calculating how much time and money it was going to take to clean all this up. And next to him, he heard Polly kind of mumble to herself that this had all been a really bad idea. Sam sighed because he knew that Polly was referring to their decision to move to the Notch in the first place. And right now, staring at all this awful destruction right in front of him, he had to agree with her. This might have been a terrible idea. So up until about a year ago, Sam and Polly and their 5 kids had lived on a farm about 20 miles away from where they were right now, and it had been a very quiet, cozy life. But Sam had always had this feeling that he wanted to do something more exciting than just be a regular old farmer. And with this house in the Notch, he'd seen an opportunity for adventure, and also an opportunity to make some money. So in this part of the White Mountain Range, there was a 12-mile-long road that cut through the range from one side to the other. And the Notch house was right in the middle of that road. But since this was the year 1826, this road was more like a glorified trail. It was mountainous and rocky, and neither horses nor wagons could make it all the way through. So as a result, travelers were typically on foot. And there was literally nowhere to stop on this whole 12-mile road except for the Willie's Notch house. So Sam had realized how valuable this Notch house could be if he converted it into an inn. But he also had bigger aspirations for the place, like beyond it just being a pit stop. He wanted to turn it into a destination. After all, the White Mountains were incredibly beautiful, and where the Willies lived in the Notch was no exception. Their house was right on a riverbank in a mountain valley, surrounded on all sides by the woods and towering mist-covered peaks. It was all honestly breathtaking. And as soon as Sam had seen it, he knew that it could be a famous destination for poets and authors and artists because it was the kind of place people would write songs and books about. I mean, it was perfect. But so far, his dream, of coming out here to the Notch house had been a lot of work. The house was large, but really old, and it had been abandoned for a while before he and his family got there, so it was in really bad shape and quite dilapidated. Sam had hired 2 men to live on the property and help him fix it up, and they'd already done some work to expand the house and the barn to accommodate more travelers. But Sam knew he still had a lot to do before the Notch house became some kind of artist's retreat. And now, with this extensive damage from the most recent storm, he had even more things to fix, which he also had to admit was actually the least of his problems. Because as he and his wife Polly looked around at the aftermath of the storm, he knew really he was lucky that their house was even still standing, and that he and his family were even still alive. I mean, that storm was catastrophic. And as Sam thought about how close they'd come to death, his heart began to race. I mean, he wondered if Polly was right, and they should really at this point just pack the family up and go back to simple farming because it was safer. But leaving meant sort of admitting failure. His big dream would be over. There would be no artist's retreat, no tourist mecca. He would not be some creative benefactor. He'd just be a farmer. So he took a deep breath, and then he asked his wife to please give this place one more chance. He promised he would do everything he possibly could to not just repair the property, but also make it safe and secure so it could withstand whatever the mountain threw at them. And Polly hesitated, but ultimately she believed in her husband, and she nodded in agreement. For the next 2 months, Sam and his 2 hired workers worked practically around the clock repairing the damage from the storm. They fixed up windows and shingles and cleared away all the debris, which took forever. And then once all the repairs were done, Sam continued working, but now he focused on improving the property. As the weeks passed by, he worked very hard to build his family a very secure home so they'd be much safer against future storms. He reinforced walls and built a whole new roof and mapped out disaster scenarios so that he and his family would always be prepared. One disaster scenario that he was especially concerned about was the large boulder that was right behind their house. He was worried that if there was another big rock slide, that boulder might just topple onto them and crush them. And he and his workers soon realized that they couldn't actually move the boulder. It was just way too big. But in the end, they found a very creative way to make sure it would not be dangerous. And while Sam did all this work, he started to feel a lot better about everything. Each security measure he put in place was proof that he didn't have to sacrifice his ambitions for his family's safety. He could have both. A few weeks later, on the night of August 28th, Sam Willie stood by a downstairs window watching another wild storm rage outside. Heavy rain pummeled the glass, and Sam could hear powerful wind battering the sides of the house. It was pitch black out, but every now and then there was a burst of lightning that would light the whole valley up for a few seconds before it went dark again. Each time this happened, a crash of thunder would follow that was so loud it shook the house down to its foundation. Behind Sam, Polly, along with their 5 kids and the 2 men that were working on the property, were all sitting at the kitchen table. And Polly and the kids in particular were very scared, and the whole group were reading Bible verses, in these kind of frantic hushed tones, like they were trying to, will the storm to be over and to cling on to their faith, to pray that they'd be okay. Sam could hear the fear in his wife's voice, and he really couldn't blame her, because this was quite possibly the strongest storm that either of them had ever seen out here. It was even bigger than that one that completely destroyed their property over the summer. The rain seemed impossibly powerful, coming down so hard and so fast that the river had already overflowed. And each time there was a burst of lightning, Sam could see the water levels were getting higher and higher almost by the second. And so Sam was admittedly quite scared himself. He tried to keep that in, but his heart was racing and he was really anxious. But he told himself that this was the moment he'd prepared for all summer long. I mean, this was it. He had done so much work to make sure this was a safe place during storms. And he felt like they'd be okay. But at the same time, the deafening sounds outside and the terrified voices of Polly and his kids were making it really hard to believe that was actually true, that they were really okay here. So for a little while, Sam just kept looking out the window, listening to his family behind him, but then eventually he turned around and as calm as he could, he told them all to go to bed. It was going to be fine. He would stay up and keep watch. Polly, who was visibly still very scared, nodded and got up and went off with the kids. And for the next few hours, Sam stayed at his post by the window and watched the storm. And for the most part, there wasn't a whole lot of drama. I mean, it was very loud and windy. It was obvious the river was flooding. I mean, there was going to be damage tomorrow, but Sam was thinking that, maybe we're going to get through this thing. But a little after midnight, Sam heard this sudden, extremely loud banging sound outside, and he froze because he knew it was not thunder. It sounded more like an explosion. Almost immediately, Sam knew what it had to have been. The barn must have collapsed. And thinking that this storm had just taken out an entire building that he had reinforced for a storm, turned Sam's worry into outright panic. And so Sam screams for his wife and the workers and his kids to wake up, that it's not safe, get away from the windows, we have to find cover. And so for the next few seconds, the family and the workers, everyone's frantically scrambling around, trying to find a safe spot, but they don't know where it is. But as they're sort of navigating, trying to find the right place to go to weather the storm, Sam heard an even louder bang, and then there were screams all around him, and then he felt himself go airborne as a heavy object slammed into his back. The following evening, an exhausted traveler named John Barker walked down that road in the direction of the Notch House where the Willies lived. So John was a merchant, and he was passing through the White Mountains on his way home after a business trip. And he had made this trip many times before. He knew the road, but the road currently was flooded and there was rock slides and damage everywhere, so it was quite slow going and pretty miserable. But he knew at the halfway point was this house, the Notch House, where Sam Willie and his family lived, and they were looking to convert their house into an inn for travelers. And even though it wasn't fully established yet, John knew he could very likely get into that house, have a hot meal, rest a little bit before he made the rest of his journey. But when he finally rounded the corner into the valley where the house was, he just froze because the area was a complete disaster. The river had clearly completely flooded, and now half the land in front of him was just underwater. There had also been clearly a huge rock slide. The barn was only half standing, and the field in front of the Willies was completely buried in rocks and mountain debris. But the truly astonishing thing was that in the middle of all this destruction and ruin, the Willies' house was still standing. And as John maneuvered his way closer to it, he realized it was more than just intact. The house was pristine. There wasn't a single thing broken or out of place, not even a window. Relieved and a little amazed, John hurried right up to the entrance and knocked. But no one answered. So eventually he just opened the door and poked his head in and called out to Sam. But he didn't hear anything. No sound of a reply and nobody moving around inside. So John tentatively stepped all the way into the house and just kept calling out to the family as he walked from room to room. But he quickly realized the house was completely empty. It was also a mess. There were clothes scattered all over the floor and beds, and sheets had been yanked around and were messy, and the The Bible was wide open on the kitchen table. John stood in the middle of the home trying to work out what could have happened here. The mess suggested that, clearly the family had been here somewhat recently, but had left in a hurry. So John guessed they must have gone down the mountain to wait out the storm somewhere else, either at a neighbor's or the tavern, miles away at the end of the road. And since the Willies were not here to allow him to stay, John needed to figure out what he was going to do. He didn't really like the idea of still sleeping in the home without them here. But he really had nowhere else to go. And it was almost nighttime, and he could barely manage the ruined road during the daylight, let alone during the dark. So even though he felt kind of bad about it, he picked a bed and tried to get some rest. But just as he began to drift off, he heard a deep, guttural moaning sound coming from somewhere outside the house. John immediately woke up and rushed over to a window. But he couldn't see anything. Night came really fast in the White Mountains, and it was almost completely dark outside. He waited to see if he would hear anything else, but he didn't. So he decided he must have imagined the sound and turned to go back to bed. But as he did, the moaning started again, and this time it was louder. John gasped as a terrible thought occurred to him. He wondered if maybe the sound was one of the Willies and that they hadn't actually left the property, but were maybe outside, injured or in trouble because of this storm. So John sprinted outside, but again, it was pitch black outside and he didn't have any kind of light to help guide his way. And so once he was out there, he just began shouting out, calling out to whoever it was, asking if they needed help. And eventually, the horrible moaning answered him. But the moaning kind of echoed all over the valley, so John couldn't pinpoint where it was actually coming from, other than it clearly being outside somewhere. After frantically looking around and not finding whoever it was, John realized that finding the injured person was going to be impossible right now. It was just too dark, and he would unfortunately have to wait until the morning. So, very reluctantly, John went back inside the house, and for hours he just sat in bed and listened to the moaning continue outside. Finally, in the morning, when the first bit of sun peeked over the mountain ridge, John hurried right outside to look around. And this time, he quickly found the source of that moaning sound. It was one of the Willies' oxen, moaning in pain from being trapped under some debris near the ruins of their barn. John immediately rushed forward and began hauling the wooden planks and rocks off the ox. And after he had freed the animal, it amazingly staggered to its feet and hobbled away into the woods. It was basically okay. But after it was gone, John felt this sort of sick uneasiness, even though the sound had been from an ox and he had saved it. He just felt like there was something wrong here, and so he decided that he had to go and see the Willies with his own eyes, just to make sure they really were okay. So even though it was really early and John was still very tired, he immediately gathered up his things and set off down the road. Hours later, around noon that same day, John Barker finally staggered out of the mostly destroyed pass and made his way towards the tavern at the bottom of the road. When John stepped inside, he was exhausted, he was drenched, from this awful journey he had just taken again on this road. But more than that, he was really worried about the Willies, because as he made that trip down the road, he saw neighbors' homes along the way and kind of expected to see the Willies in one of them. But no, the Willies were not in any of the neighbors' homes, and in fact, basically none of the neighbors were in their houses either. They were all basically in this tavern. It was like everybody who lived on this road had come to this tavern because of this storm. But when John looked around the tavern, he could tell the Willies were not in there either, and this made John's stomach drop. Because if they weren't at their house, and they weren't in any of the neighbors' homes, and now they were not in this tavern with the rest of their neighbors, that had to mean something was wrong. And so John actually called out to the entire room and asked if anyone had seen the Willies since the storm. And the tavern got really quiet as its occupants all began looking around at each other, seeing if anybody had, but eventually everyone just shook their head and said, no, we don't know where they are. And that's when John said to the crowd that, well, the Willies are missing. A few hours later, a 12-man search party left that tavern and headed right back up the road towards the Notch. They were led by one of the Willies' neighbors, a man named Edward Melcher, who lived at the base of the mountain on a farm with his family. The recent storm had done quite a bit of damage to Edward's property, and so he and his family, like most other people that lived in this area, had gone to the tavern to seek shelter. Edward and his family, much like the Willies, were good people who were just trying to carve out a living in this part of the world. And there were not a lot of people doing that. This was a very small community, and so they always helped each other out whenever they could. and so this was no exception. But as desperately as Edward and the rest of the search party wanted to get to the Willies property and find these people, it took so long to navigate the road that by the time they actually got to the property, it was after midnight and really too dark to look for anything. So they just went right into the Willies' house to wait until morning. Once he was inside, Edward could see, the home really was just as John described. It was sort of a mess, but there was absolutely no damage to it from the storm. Edward had heard that Sam was really freaked out about a storm that they had had earlier that summer, and because of that storm and because of the damage it had done, he had gone way out of his way to really develop his property to prepare it for the next storm. And it seemed like all his preparations and reinforcements on his land had paid off because here his house was standing tall. But that was also kind of confusing. It's like, if you prepared this house for a storm, and clearly it was able to withstand the storm, why did the Willies leave? As Edward continued to walk around the house, he saw that the Willies' Bible was still lying on the kitchen table wide open, and when he leaned over and read the passage that was on the page, he couldn't help but, kind of shiver when he saw what it said. It said, "The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire." Hours later, when the sun finally began to come up, Edward and the others went outside and began searching the property for signs of the Willies. And over the next few hours, the original party of 12 grew as more and more people showed up to assist in the search. By this point, word had spread pretty far about the family's disappearance, and so residents from all over the White Mountains had come here to help. And eventually, hundreds of people were combing the mountainside to find the Willies, or at least to find a clue about where they might have gone. At around noon, when still there had been nothing found, Edward decided he would go search closer to the river, since by this point, the water levels had gone down some. And when he got to the water's edge, he began to hear this strange buzzing sound, and so he followed it, and eventually he saw something poking out from behind some debris. And when he saw what it was, Edward began to scream for help. So the thing that Sam Willie was most afraid of happening in a large storm was a rock slide, especially with that huge boulder positioned right behind his house. But when Sam realized it was going to be impossible to move said boulder, or otherwise shield his family from falling mountain rocks, he came up with a pretty creative solution. He built a whole second shelter that he and his family could run to if there was a bad storm. And when that second storm hit, the one that had caused all this damage and had led to the Willies' disappearance, well, during that storm, Sam's screaming for his family to, take cover, get away from the windows. He's heard this crashing sound outside that he is convinced is the sound of his barn collapsing, and, his house is next. He's yelling for them to take cover. Well, the family listened to him, and together they did seek cover. They left the main house and went into that second shelter that they believed was better protected from a potential rock slide. But unfortunately, this would be a catastrophic mistake because that humongous boulder right behind the house was not actually a safety risk. In many ways, it was like a protective barrier. When there was an actual rock slide during this horrible storm, well, the rubble actually piled up on the backside of that boulder and did not strike the house at all. And so in essence, this boulder basically made the Willies' original home the single safest place to be on the whole property. But unfortunately, Sam and his family did not stay there long enough to realize that. They ran out of the main house as a big group, and as soon as they were outside, they were overtaken by the rock slide and killed. Eventually, the residents of the White Mountains would find the family. The buzzing that Edward heard was actually a group of flies gathered around a single human hand reached out from underneath the rubble. Ultimately, because of this tragedy, the area became a famous tourist destination, just like the Willies had hoped it would. People from all over the country heard about the family and what happened, and before long, artists and authors were coming to the White Mountains in droves to see the site of the tragedy, and some even wrote books about it. And so, in a sort of cruel twist of fate, Sam's dream did come true, just not in the way he hoped. On one of the last nights in December of 1678, Marie Bosse sat at a large table at a friend's dinner party in the city of Paris, France. The table was crowded with other party guests, and they were all listening to Marie as she told story after story about her life and her career. So Marie was a fortune teller, which meant, at least according to her, that she could read people's futures, usually by reading their palms or using crystals. And Marie was actually quite good at doing this, in the sense that whenever she told someone what their future was going to be, she typically was right, which was why, out of the 400-something fortune tellers in Paris at the time, she had some of the best and most important clients in the whole city. People like royalty and wives of very high-up government members and other very wealthy people of high society. And it was a big deal for Marie to even be in the same room as some of these kinds of people, because she did not come from money. Actually, there was a time where she almost had to live out on the streets, because years ago, when her husband died, she was left alone with her 3 kids and really no way to provide for them. But she'd worked very hard and actually ended up thriving. Her kids had grown up, and she turned her fortune-telling talents into a real business. She'd been so successful that she really was maybe about 3 clients away from being able to retire. And Marie was not one to just sit back and let those clients magically find her. She was a self-made woman and knew it was very important to go out and find those clients herself. And so that's why she was at this party now. It was being hosted by a friend of hers who was also in the fortune-telling scene, and so many of the guests at this table were new potential clients that Marie really hoped to impress. So that's what Marie was trying to do now, to try to be very impressive. She was telling the other guests all these incredible tales about working with the rich and the famous. But the problem was, in addition to these fabulous stories she was telling, what was also coming through very clearly to the audience was that Marie was very drunk. So Marie was loud and talkative in general, and that extroverted attitude really helped her get clients typically. But when she got drunk, she was even more talkative than normal. And sometimes it also made her a bit inappropriate. Right now, though, she felt like she was on a roll, because her stories were drawing gasps and laughs, and the guests were pushing her to tell them more and more. But there was at least one person in the crowd that seemed bothered by what Marie was saying: the hostess of the party. The hostess kept silently glaring at Marie from the other end of the table. It was like she was silently trying to tell her to shut up. But Marie figured she knew why she was acting that way. I mean, the hostess was also a fortune teller, and so she must just be jealous. Marie's getting all this attention and potential new clients, and this wasn't even her party. Like, she just got to be jealous. So Marie ignored the glares and just kept on talking until dinner was over. And then after that, the party ended, and Marie staggered off to bed. When Marie woke up the next day, her head was absolutely pounding, and her stomach was in knots. I mean, she was severely hungover from drinking the night before. She didn't remember a whole lot about what had happened the night before, but she did remember telling a lot of stories. And she remembered that while she was telling these stories, the hostess was angrily glaring at her the whole time. And now that she was sober, a terrible thought popped into her head. She wondered if she'd said or done something that was embarrassing. What if the table wasn't laughing with her? What if they were laughing at her? And what if, the hostess glaring at her was some sort of signal to stop because she was hurting herself? And so this thought that, somehow she had done real damage to her reputation, her career, from being too drunk, continued to weigh on her throughout the entire day and into the following evening, until that night when she was in her kitchen making some dinner with her adult daughter, and there was a knock at her door. Marie hurried to open it up, and when she did, she found a young woman standing on her front steps. The woman seemed incredibly nervous and kept fidgeting and smoothing her hair, and she told Marie that she had gotten her name from someone Marie had met at that dinner party and was hoping that Marie could help her. And when she heard this, Marie smiled and exhaled out all the tension she'd been holding up over the last day. This was a huge relief to Marie. It was proof that the dinner party had not been a total embarrassment, despite the hostess glaring at her the whole time. That clearly, here she is getting a new client. She must have impressed at least this woman, and maybe there were more, like it had been a success. So very excitedly, she invited the young woman inside and led her to the area of her home where Marie conducted her business and read people's fortunes. This room had lots of strange objects placed all around it, like jars and crystals, and bottles of potions and decks of cards to make the area feel mystical and authentic. The two of them eventually sat down at Marie's small table in the middle of this room, and once they were sitting, the woman told Marie that she did want her fortune told because she had a terribly abusive husband, and she wanted to know how much longer she would have to put up with his cruelty. This didn't surprise Marie. She'd seen a lot of nervous, frail women like this one who were completely trapped in their marriages. In France at this time, divorce wasn't even legal, which meant you were stuck with your partner even if they were abusive. And so a lot of these women that were in this position turned to Marie, desperate to be told what the rest of their lives looked like, and if their lives would continue to be terrible and hard because of their partner. Marie knew that really what these women were looking for was control. They hoped that if they just knew what their future looked like, even if it was bad, they could somehow do something to change it. And so Marie, she reached out and she grabbed this woman's hand and she turned it around and she began to study her palm. Marie was trying to get a sense of what the future held for this woman by reading her palm. And pretty soon, Marie got this feeling in her gut. She felt sure that this woman actually was going to be okay. And Marie told the woman that her husband's abuse would end soon. Then she gave her some tips on what to do in the meantime. The woman was visibly relieved and thanked Marie profusely, and then when she was gone, Marie smiled. Not just because she had helped this woman, but also because, after this job, Marie would only need 2 more clients before she had enough money to retire. A few days later, on January 4th, Marie woke up to somebody banging on her door. She figured it must be a very desperate client, so she rolled out of bed and started walking to go answer it. But before she could get there, the door flew open and the Parisian police poured inside. Marie staggered back and just stared at them in complete shock. She had no idea what they were doing there, but they immediately just grabbed her and said she was under arrest. Marie screamed in protest and said there had to be some mistake here. She hadn't done anything wrong. And when they didn't listen to her, she got furious and demanded to be released. She told them that she was Marie Boss, and she had friends in high places like Parliament and noble circles. They could vouch for her and say that she was an honest person who just worked hard and was good for her clients and good for the city. But as she was ranting and raving, one of the officers stepped in front of her, and without reacting to what she was saying, they just showed her an object that Marie instantly recognized as having come from her fortune-telling room. And at this, her heart sank and she stopped struggling, because Marie knew that she was now in very, very big trouble. And if she was in trouble, then so were many, many other people in Paris. After Marie was arrested, she was brought to a prison in Paris called the Bastille, where she was interrogated by torture. And since Marie was already a talker, she quickly told the police everything they wanted to know. And after Marie did that, all hell broke loose. Hordes of police officers fanned out through the whole city, charging into homes and businesses all around Paris, arresting civilians, business owners, and housewives. Then they flooded the hall of the city's government and demanded high-ranking officials in parliament surrender their wives to authorities, throwing the Parisian government into absolute chaos. And even after all of that, the authorities still weren't finished. They left the city and began forcing the French nobility out of their castles to go face charges in the city. Months turned into years, and the arrests continued to pile up, and each one was more shocking than the last, until the investigation led authorities to the actual royal palace in Paris and to the king's favorite mistress. By the time the police finished their investigation, hundreds of people all across France, ranging from commoners to literal royalty, were either facing charges or sitting in jail cells. And screams filled the halls of these prisons as the arrested were tortured for whatever information they might have. Scores of people fled the country, and then eventually, all around Paris, these enormous pyres were built in the public squares. And one by one, dozens and dozens of people were led out to these pyres, strapped to the poles in the middle of them, and then burned to death in front of thousands of Parisian spectators. And it was all because of Marie. So Marie Boss was not just a fortune teller. She made her real money by making and selling poison. And it would turn out that she was not the only one. In fact, at the time, you could say Paris basically ran on poison. Since the late 1660s, according to one estimate, around half of the people who lived in that city, from housewives to literal royalty, had poisoned someone or been poisoned by someone. It had become absurdly common for people, especially rich people, to buy poison from Marie and the network of 400 or so other poisoners around the city and use it to quietly commit murder so that the victims' deaths looked natural. But poison was not just used to kill people. It was sort of used like a solution for many kinds of problems, like people who wanted their romantic interests to be easier to seduce, well, they'd buy poison and poison them. Or people that had abusive or unappealing partners, they would use poison to make them sick and bedridden, because remember, they can't get divorced. So if you're stuck with somebody and you don't like them, well, just poison them. It was also alleged that King Louis XIV himself was poisoned in non-fatal doses by his mistress, who wanted to make him easier to manipulate. Poison was even used for entertainment. One duo of poisoners baked deadly substances into cakes and handed them out to unsuspecting patients at a local hospital just to see what would happen. The poison affair, as it came to be called, was without a doubt at the time Paris's biggest and best kept secret, until Marie went to that dinner party, got really drunk, and let it slip. That night, Marie told stories of poisoning people, and people thought they were so funny because they didn't believe they were true. But one of the guests saw that the hostess of the party looked furious at Marie the whole time Marie was telling these stories. And so he wondered if maybe what Marie was talking about might actually be real, and the hostess is kind of trying to signal her to stop talking about it, but Marie was not taking the hint. So the following day, that dinner guest went to the police, and the police sent a woman to Marie's house to act as an undercover spy to see if maybe she could get proof that the poisonings were real. And lo and behold, when this woman told Marie that her husband was abusive and she just wanted to know how long this was going to go on for, Marie, read her palm and read her future, but then also gave her some tips about what to do in the meantime, which included handing her a vial of poison and saying, just go ahead and kill your husband, poison him. The object that officer had shown Marie when she was arrested was that poison. The investigation into the poison affair lasted for 3 years, and during that time, there were over 300 people who got arrested, from commoners to royalty. 23 of those people were banished, and 34 people were executed, including Marie Bosse. She was actually the first person to be burned alive on one of those pyres.